I discovered my husband's mistress on the day I found the hidden room behind the tapestry, but she had already been dead for 2 years. What I could not have known then was that the dead do not always stay silent, and some secrets demand to be seen even when they can no longer be spoken. My name is Eleanor Ashford, and in the spring of 1872, I was 24 years old and had been married for precisely 18 months to a man I barely knew. Our union was the sort that society applauded and the heart endured. I was the daughter of a textile merchant whose fortune had grown vast enough to purchase respectability, and Lionel Ashford, the Earl of Thornwick, possessed a title ancient enough to bestow it. His family's coffers had been emptied by generations of extravagance, and my father's gold filled them again. In exchange, I received a coronet and the cold, echoing halls of Thornwick Hall. I will not pretend that I entered this marriage with romantic illusions. I had been raised to understand the transactional nature of such arrangements, and I accepted my fate with the same quiet resignation with which I had accepted everything else in my life. My mother had drilled into me since childhood the importance of duty, of propriety, of sacrificing one's own desires for the sake of family advancement. She herself had been married to my father through a similar arrangement, and if she had ever loved him, she had never spoken of it. Love, she told me, was a luxury that women of our station could not afford. Lionel was not cruel. He was simply absent, even when he stood before me. His eyes, gray as the winter sky over the moors, looked through me rather than at me, and his conversation, when he offered it, concerned estate matters and parliamentary business. He slept in a separate chamber, visited mine with infrequent and perfunctory duty, and spent his evenings locked away in the east wing of the manor, attending to what he called his private affairs. I did not question him. A wife of my station did not question. I managed the household, smiled at dinner parties, nodded at the vicar's sermons, and wrote dutiful letters to my mother describing a happiness I did not feel. The servants regarded me with the polite distance reserved for outsiders, and the neighboring families received me with the barely concealed condescension that old money reserves for new. I was tolerated, but I was not embraced. Thornwick Hall, with its ancient stones and whispering corridors, did not want me. The loneliness was a constant companion, as familiar as the ticking of the clocks and the distant rumble of carriages on the drive. I filled my days with needlework and correspondence, with planning menus and inspecting linens, with all the meaningless tasks that society deemed appropriate for a woman of my position. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the house slept and even the servants had retired, I wandered the corridors like a ghost myself, searching for something I could not name. It was loneliness that drove me to exploration. On an afternoon in late March, when the rain beat against the windows and the hours stretched interminably before me, I found myself wandering through the unused portions of the house. Thornwick Hall was vast, a sprawling testament to centuries of accumulated wealth and ambition, and much of it had been closed off to save the expense of heating and maintaining rooms that no one used. I had been told that these wings contained nothing but dust and forgotten furniture, but I was restless, and dust seemed preferable to the suffocating silence of my own sitting room. The East Wing, where Lionel spent his evenings, was forbidden to me. He had made that clear early in our marriage, citing the dangerous condition of the floors and the presence of documents related to the estate that required absolute privacy. I had accepted this prohibition without argument, though I had often wondered what could possibly require such secrecy. Estate documents were not, in my experience, matters that required a man to lock himself away for hours on end, emerging only when the candles had burned low and the night had grown old. But on that gray afternoon, I found my feet carrying me not to the East Wing, but to the gallery that ran along the north side of the house, where generations of Ashford ancestors stared down from their portraits with expressions of aristocratic disdain. The gallery was cold and dim, lit only by the pale light filtering through rain-streaked windows. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and the air smelled of dust and old canvas and the faint lingering scent of wood polish. I walked slowly past the paintings, studying faces I did not know, reading the small brass plaques that identified them. There were earls and countesses, stretching back to the reign of Elizabeth, their ruffs and jewels and stern expressions marking the passage of centuries. Some faces repeated through the generations, the same strong jaw or high forehead appearing again and again, testament to the power of blood and lineage. Near the end of the gallery hung the most recent addition, a large painting in an ornate gilt frame depicting Lionel's parents, the late Earl and Countess of Thornwick, seated in the library with their son standing behind them. I had seen this portrait before, of course. It hung in a place of honor, and the servants kept it dusted and polished. But I had never examined it closely, and something about it caught my attention that afternoon. Perhaps it was the quality of the light, the way the rain-washed sunshine fell across the canvas at just this angle. Perhaps it was simply that I had nothing better to do than stare at painted faces and wonder about the lives they had lived. Lionel in the painting was younger, perhaps 20, his face softer and less guarded than the one I knew. He stood with one hand on his father's chair, the posture of a dutiful son. But there was something in his eyes, even then, that suggested distance, a part of himself held back from the scene being depicted. His mother, Lady Catherine, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene and distant, a woman who had mastered the art of revealing nothing. She had been beautiful, I thought, in the cold way that aristocratic women were often beautiful, all sharp bones and careful composure. But it was his father who drew my eye. The late Earl had died 5 years before my marriage, and I had never met him. But his painted face seemed to hold a secret, a knowledge that the artist had captured without understanding. His eyes were dark and penetrating, and there was a set to his mouth that suggested either cruelty or disappointment. I could not decide which. I was studying the portrait when I noticed the tapestry. It hung on the wall beside the painting, an elaborate scene of a hunt that I had passed 100 times without truly seeing. The colors had faded with age, but I could make out horses and hounds, hunters in period dress, a stag fleeing through a forest rendered in countless tiny stitches. It was the sort of decorative piece that one stopped seeing after a while, just part of the background of a great house, unremarkable and unexamined. But the rain had created a draft in the gallery, and the tapestry moved, billowing slightly away from the wall. And in that movement, I glimpsed something that should not have been there, a darkness, a gap, the edge of what appeared to be a door. My heart quickened. I glanced behind me, confirming that I was alone, and then I approached the tapestry and lifted its heavy edge. The fabric was thick and dusty, weighted at the bottom with tassels that had once been gold but had tarnished to a dull bronze. It took some effort to hold it aside, but when I did, I found myself staring at a narrow door set into the wall. It was old, its wood darkened with age, and it had no visible handle or lock. The surface was smooth, worn by years or perhaps by touch, and there was a small depression where one might place a palm to push it open. I looked at the door, and the door seemed to look back at me, a secret mouth waiting to speak. I should have stepped back. I should have let the tapestry fall and returned to my sitting room and never spoken of what I had found. The sensible course of action would have been to mention the door to Lionel, to allow him to explain its existence and forbid my entry. I was his wife. I was bound by vows of obedience. The secrets of his house were his to keep or reveal as he saw fit. But I was not the obedient wife I had been taught to be, not entirely, and the loneliness that had driven me to wander that afternoon now drove me forward. I found a candle on a nearby table, lit it with matches from my pocket, and stepped into the passage. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the walls were rough stone that had never been plastered or papered. It was cold in here, the chill of spaces long sealed, and the air was stale with the peculiar mustiness of places that have not been properly ventilated. I smelled dust and age and something else, something faintly sweet that I could not identify, like perfume that had lingered long after the woman who wore it had gone. I walked slowly, holding my candle high, my free hand trailing along the wall to steady myself. The stone was damp under my fingertips, and I could feel the weight of the house above me, centuries of history pressing down on this hidden artery. The passage turned once, then again, the candle flame dancing with each corner, casting wild shadows on the walls. And then it opened into a room. It was larger than I had expected, perhaps 15 feet square, with a low ceiling and no windows. The candle's flame cast dancing shadows across walls covered in faded silk, the kind of fabric that had been fashionable decades ago, in deep shades of burgundy and gold that had dulled with time. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply looking, trying to understand what I had found. The room was furnished. There was a bed, narrow but elegant, with hangings of deep crimson that had dulled to rust. The headboard was carved with roses, and the linens, though dusty, appeared to have once been fine. There was a vanity with a mirror, the glass spotted with age but still reflective. A wardrobe stood against one wall, its doors closed. A small writing desk sat near what would have been a fireplace if there had been any way for smoke to escape, and a chair upholstered in velvet that had once been blue completed the arrangement. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but beneath that dust, the room was perfect, preserved, as if its occupant had simply stepped out and never returned. There were no cobwebs, no signs of decay beyond the natural fading of fabrics. Someone had lived here, and someone had cared for this space, at least for a time. I moved through the room in a daze, touching objects, trying to understand what I had found. On the vanity sat bottles of perfume, their contents long evaporated, but the faint ghost of their scent still clinging to the glass. A hairbrush lay beside them. Silver-backed and finely made, and caught in its bristles were strands of dark hair, almost black, preserved like relics. A hand mirror, its surface clouded, lay face down beside a powder box of porcelain. The wardrobe, when I opened it, contained gowns, beautiful gowns of silk and satin and lace, in styles that were perhaps 5 years out of fashion, but still elegant, still clearly expensive. I ran my fingers over the fabrics, feeling the quality of the weave, and I imagined the woman who had worn them, who had stood before that spotted mirror and arranged her dark hair and dabbed perfume on her wrists before going to meet someone in this hidden room. On the writing desk lay letters, their seals broken, their pages covered in a flowing feminine hand. I picked up the topmost letter and read it by candlelight. "My dearest Lionel," it began, "the days are so long without you, and the nights longer still. I know you cannot come to me as often as we both wish, but I live for those stolen hours when you hold me, and the world beyond these walls ceases to exist. Yesterday I practiced the aria you love, the one from La Traviata, and I imagined you were listening. I imagined your eyes on me as I sang, that look you have when the music moves you, and it was almost as if you were here." I lowered the letter, my hands trembling. I did not need to read more to understand what I had discovered. This room, this hidden chamber concealed behind a tapestry in a forgotten gallery, had been a love nest. My husband had kept a woman here, a mistress, hidden away from the world, visiting her in secret while his wife, whoever she had been at the time, believed he was attending to business. The knowledge should have devastated me. Perhaps it would have, had I loved him. But what I felt as I stood in that dusty room was not heartbreak. It was something more complex, a mixture of anger and pity and a strange, hollow curiosity. Who was she? This woman who had lived in shadows. Where was she now? And why had this room been preserved so perfectly, as if waiting for her return? I searched the room more thoroughly, reading letters, examining belongings, piecing together the story of a life lived in secret. Her name was Cecilia Vane. She had been a singer, an opera performer of modest fame who had caught Lionel's eye at a performance in London. Her voice, according to the letters, was extraordinary, capable of bringing audiences to tears. But more than her voice, it seemed, Lionel had loved her spirit, her passion, the way she threw herself into every moment as if life itself were an opera and she its star. Their affair had begun before his parents died, before he inherited the title and the responsibility of finding a suitable wife. He had loved her. That much was clear from her letters, from the tenderness with which she wrote of him, from the longing that permeated every page. She spoke of walks they had taken in the moonlit garden, of poems he had read to her by candlelight, of plans they had made for a future that could never come. But he could not marry her. She was nobody, a performer, a woman of talent, but no family and no fortune. The Earl of Thornwick could not make such a woman his countess. Society would never have accepted her, and his father, that stern figure in the portrait, would have disowned him. And so he had hidden her here, in this room behind the tapestry, visiting her when he could, keeping her like a songbird in a gilded cage. The letters spanned 3 years. They spoke of joy and sorrow, of passionate nights and lonely days, of a love that was fierce and desperate and ultimately impossible. There were happy letters, filled with descriptions of music and laughter and the small pleasures of their secret life together. Cecilia wrote of learning new arias, practicing for hours in her hidden room, her voice echoing off the stone walls with no one to hear but herself and the mice in the wainscoting. She wrote of reading poetry by candlelight, of teaching herself to play the piano on the small instrument that had been smuggled into her room, of composing her own music as a way to fill the empty hours. There were sad letters, written during the long stretches when Lionel could not visit, when Cecilia waited alone in her hidden room and wondered if he would ever come again. In these letters, her loneliness was palpable, a living presence that seemed to seep from the pages themselves. She wrote of watching the shadows move across the walls as the sun set outside windows she could not see, of counting the chimes of the clock in the distant hallway, of pressing her ear to the door in hopes of hearing footsteps that never came. "I am like the princess in the tower," she wrote in one such letter, "waiting for my prince to rescue me. But my tower has no window, and my prince cannot slay the dragon that guards me, because the dragon is the world itself, and the world cannot be defeated." There were anxious letters, written as Lionel's father grew more insistent about the need for a proper marriage, as the walls closed in on their impossible love. Cecilia understood even then that their arrangement could not last forever. She knew that Lionel would eventually be forced to choose between her and his duty, and she knew, with a certainty that broke her heart, which choice he would make. "I do not blame you, my love," she wrote. "I have never blamed you. The fault lies not in our hearts, but in the world that will not let us be. If I could change anything, I would change nothing of what we have shared, only the circumstances that prevent us from sharing it forever." And then, abruptly, the letters stopped. The last letter was dated 2 years before my marriage, and its tone was different from the others. The flowing script was less steady, the words more scattered across the page, as if written by a hand that trembled with weakness or fear. Cecilia wrote of feeling unwell, of a persistent cough that would not clear, of a heaviness in her chest that frightened her. She wrote of nights spent sleepless, struggling to breathe, and days spent in a haze of fever and exhaustion. She wrote of her fear that she was dying, and of her greater fear that she would die here, in this hidden room, and no one would ever know that she had lived. "I have asked so little of you, my love," she wrote. "I have accepted this half-life, this existence in shadows, because it was all you could offer, and because any part of you was better than none. But now I am afraid. I feel my strength failing, and I know that whatever illness has taken hold of me will not release its grip. Promise me, Lionel. Promise me that you will not let me be forgotten. Promise me that something of me will survive, even if my name can never be spoken aloud." The letter ended there, unsigned, as if she had lacked the strength to complete it. I held it in my trembling hands and felt tears on my cheeks, tears for a woman I had never met, whose love had been so great and whose fate had been so cruel. I lowered the letter and looked around the room with new eyes. Had she died here? Had Lionel buried her secretly, concealing not only her life, but her death from the world? I searched for some sign, some evidence, but found nothing. No grave marker, no memorial, nothing to indicate where Cecilia Vane had gone or what had become of her. The room held its secrets close, as it had held Cecilia close for all those years. And I, standing in the midst of her abandoned belongings, felt the weight of her story settle on my shoulders like a mantle, binding me to her memory, whether I wished it or not. I gathered the letters and the hairbrush with its dark strands, and I left the hidden room the way I had come, sealing the door behind me and letting the tapestry fall back into place. I returned to my sitting room and sat for a long time in the gathering darkness, trying to understand what I had learned and what it meant for my own life. I was not angry at Lionel, not really. How could I be? He had loved Cecilia before he ever knew me, and our marriage had been an arrangement of convenience, not a union of hearts. I had entered it with my eyes open, knowing that I was a transaction, not a choice. The fact that he had loved another woman, that he had hidden her away and cherished her in secret, did not change the fundamental nature of our relationship. But it explained so much. His distance, his distraction, the way he looked through me as if searching for someone else. He was not cold by nature, he was grieving. He had lost the woman he loved, and he was trapped in a marriage to a woman he barely knew, going through the motions of a life that held no meaning for him. That night, I watched Lionel across the dinner table with different eyes. He looked tired, I realized. There were lines around his mouth that I had not noticed before, and a heaviness in his gaze that suggested sleepless nights. He spoke little, answering my attempts at conversation with monosyllables, and when dinner ended, he retreated to the east wing as he always did, closing the door on whatever memories or regrets he carried with him. I retired to my chamber and lay awake until dawn, listening to the rain and thinking of a woman I had never met, whose ghost seemed to linger in the air around me. I wondered what she had looked like, this Cecilia with her dark hair and her extraordinary voice. I wondered if she had been beautiful, if she had been kind, if she had resented the woman who would eventually take her place as Countess of Thornwick. I wondered if she had known at the end that she was dying, and if she had forgiven Lionel for not being able to save her. Most of all, I wondered why her room had been preserved so perfectly, as if waiting for her return. Why had Lionel not cleared it out, removed all traces of her existence? Was it guilt that stayed his hand, or hope, or simply the inability to face the evidence of his loss? These questions haunted me in the days that followed, but they were soon eclipsed by something far more troubling. It was 3 days later that the portrait began to change. I noticed it on a morning when pale spring sunlight had finally broken through the clouds. The rain had stopped in the night, and the world outside my window was fresh and clean, the grass sparkling with moisture, the birds singing as if in celebration. I felt lighter than I had in days, and I decided to take a walk through the gallery. Ostensibly to admire the portraits, in truth, to be near the hidden door and the secret it concealed. Something about the family portrait caught my attention the moment I entered the gallery. I stopped and stared, certain that my eyes were deceiving me. Lady Catherine's face was wrong. I stepped closer, my heart beginning to pound. The portrait was the same as it had always been, the same composition, the same figures in the same positions. The late Earl sat in his chair with his stern expression. Lionel stood behind, his hand on his father's shoulder. Lady Catherine occupied her place with her hands folded in her lap, but her features had shifted. Her eyes, which I remembered as pale blue, now seemed darker, almost black. Her hair, which had been fair, showed strands of deep chestnut, and her face, while still beautiful, had taken on a different shape, with higher cheekbones and a fuller mouth than I recalled. I told myself that I was imagining things. I had been dwelling too much on Cecilia Vane, and my mind was playing tricks. The portrait was old, and the light in the gallery was changeable, and memory was unreliable. I had looked at the painting 100 times without really seeing it, and now I was projecting my own obsessions onto the canvas. But even as I reasoned with myself, I knew that something was wrong. Something had changed that could not be explained by light or memory or imagination. I stood before the portrait for nearly an hour, studying every brushstroke, comparing what I saw to what I remembered. And when I finally left the gallery, I was more certain than ever that the impossible had occurred. The face in the portrait was changing. Over the following days, I returned to the portrait again and again, studying it, comparing it to my recollections. And each time I looked, the transformation had progressed. Lady Catherine's features were disappearing, slowly but unmistakably, replaced by another face entirely. A face I had never seen, but one I felt I knew from the letters I had read and the belongings I had touched. A face with dark eyes and dark hair and an expression of profound sadness. Cecilia Vane was appearing on the canvas. I began to doubt my sanity. I spoke to no one of what I was seeing, certain that any mention of a changing portrait would result in whispered concerns about my mental state. The servants already regarded me with suspicion, the outsider who had married into their master's family. If they thought me mad as well as common, my position in the household would become untenable. But the transformation continued, day by day, feature by feature, until the woman in the painting bore no resemblance to the late Countess of Thornwick. She was Cecilia, I was certain of it. Cecilia, whose hidden room I had discovered, whose letters I had read, whose fate remained a mystery. Her dark eyes looked out from the canvas with an expression that was neither accusatory nor peaceful, but somewhere in between. It was the look of someone waiting, someone who had been waiting for a very long time. The servants noticed nothing, or if they did, they said nothing. The household continued its routines, and Lionel remained as distant as ever, and I walked through my days feeling as though I were the only person who could see what was happening, the only witness to a miracle or a madness that I could not explain. I tried to find rational explanations. Perhaps the portrait had always looked this way, and I had simply never noticed. Perhaps there was some chemical reaction occurring in the paint, some interaction of oils and pigments that caused features to shift over time. Perhaps I was simply losing my mind, projecting my own preoccupations onto an innocent canvas. But none of these explanations satisfied me. The changes were too specific, too deliberate. It was not random degradation that I was witnessing. It was transformation, as if some invisible hand were repainting the portrait, stroke by stroke, replacing one woman with another. I began to spend hours in the gallery, watching the painting, waiting for it to change before my eyes. I brought a sketchbook and made drawings of the face as it appeared each day, documenting the slow evolution from Catherine to Cecilia. I compared my sketches to the portrait, confirming that the changes were real, that I was not imagining them. And at night, when the house was silent and the candles had been extinguished, I dreamed of a woman with dark hair standing before a mirror, singing an aria from La Traviata, while tears streamed down her face. It was during this period of private terror that society intervened in the most unexpected way. Word had reached London of strange occurrences at Thornwick Hall. I never learned exactly how the rumors began, whether some servant had talked or some visitor had noticed something amiss. But within a fortnight, the story had spread through the drawing rooms of the capital. The portrait at Thornwick was haunted, they said. A ghost was making itself known through the canvas, changing the image, demanding to be seen. I was appalled when I first heard the rumors. The scandal might have been catastrophic. Lionel could have found himself the subject of mockery and speculation, his family's reputation tarnished by association with the supernatural. But the Victorian fascination with spiritualism worked in our favor. What might have been scandal became intrigue. What might have been embarrassment became fashion. And when letters began to arrive requesting permission to visit Thornwick Hall and witness the phenomenon, Lionel found himself unable to refuse without appearing defensive. It was in this way that Inspector Marcus Hale came to our door. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early April, his card preceding him by only an hour. The card was simple, engraved with his name and title, Inspector Marcus Hale, Criminal Investigation Department, Scotland Yard. There was no indication of why a criminal investigator would be interested in a haunted portrait, but his letter of introduction, written in a neat, precise hand, explained that he had been assigned to investigate reports of unusual activity at Thornwick Hall. The Yard had been asked to determine whether there was any criminal element to the situation, or whether it was simply a matter for spiritualists and sensation seekers. I received him in the drawing room while Lionel was away on estate business, and I studied him with the careful attention I had learned to give to strangers in this house where everyone seemed to be hiding something. He was not what I expected of a police inspector. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair silvered at the temples and a face that was more thoughtful than stern. His eyes were gray like my husband's, but where Lionel's gaze was distant and preoccupied, Inspector Hale's was penetrating, observant, taking in every detail of the room and of me with quiet intensity. He was tall and lean, dressed in well-cut but unassuming clothes, and he moved with the controlled grace of a man who was accustomed to watching and waiting. "Lady Ashford," he said, bowing slightly, "I apologize for the intrusion. I have been sent to investigate reports of unusual activity at Thornwick Hall. I understand this must be inconvenient." "Not at all, Inspector," I replied, gesturing for him to sit. "We have nothing to hide." He took a chair near the fire, declining tea with a brief shake of his head. His manner was polite but direct, and I found myself responding in kind. There was something about him that invited honesty, a quality I had not encountered in any of the society gentlemen I had met since my marriage. "You have come about the portrait," I said. He inclined his head. "I have. The story has caused quite a stir in London. The Yard has been asked to determine whether there is any criminal element to the situation, or whether it is simply a matter for spiritualists and sensation seekers." He paused. "I understand that you have been living at Thornwick Hall for some time, Lady Ashford. May I ask what you have observed?" I considered my answer carefully. I could have told him the official version, that the rumors were exaggerated, that nothing unusual had occurred. But something about his gray eyes, so attentive and intelligent, made me want to tell the truth. "I have observed the portrait changing," I said quietly. "I know how that sounds. But I have watched it happen, day by day. The face of the countess is being replaced by another face entirely." His expression remained neutral, but I saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. "You believe this is a supernatural phenomenon?" "I do not know what to believe," I admitted. "I only know what I have seen." He nodded slowly. "I would like to see this portrait for myself, if you will permit it." I led him through the corridors to the North Gallery. The afternoon light was soft and golden, falling through the tall windows and illuminating the rows of ancestral faces. Inspector Hale walked slowly, his gaze moving from portrait to portrait, taking in the centuries of Ashford history with professional detachment. I watched him study the paintings, wondering what he saw, what judgments he was forming about this family and its secrets. And then we reached the family portrait, and he stopped. I watched his face as he looked at the painting, searching for some sign of what he was seeing and thinking. His expression remained composed, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly, and his eyes narrowed as he leaned closer to the canvas. "This is the portrait in question?" he asked. "It is. The woman there, the countess. She did not always look like that." He studied the face in the painting for a long moment. The woman who gazed back at us had dark eyes and dark hair, high cheekbones and a full mouth. She was beautiful in a way that Lady Catherine had not been, with a warmth and expressiveness that seemed at odds with the formal composition of the portrait. "You knew the late countess?" he asked. "No. She died before my marriage, but I have seen other portraits of her, and this is not her face." He nodded slowly. Then he turned to me, and his eyes met mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Tell me everything, Lady Ashford, from the beginning." And so I did. I told him about finding the hidden room, about the letters and the belongings, about Cecilia Vane and her secret life behind the tapestry. I told him about watching the portrait change, day by day, feature by feature, until the face of the dead countess was replaced by the face of my husband's lost love. I told him things I had not told anyone, not because I trusted him, but because I was desperate to be believed, to have someone, anyone, confirm that I was not losing my mind. He listened without interrupting, his attention fixed on me with an intensity that was almost unnerving. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the portrait. "You believe this woman, Cecilia Vane, is somehow responsible for the changes to the painting?" "I do not know what to believe," I admitted. "I only know what I have seen." He nodded slowly. "I would like to examine the hidden room, if you will permit it." I led him back through the gallery, lifted the tapestry, and opened the concealed door. He produced a small lantern from his coat and lit it, and together we entered the narrow passage and made our way to the hidden chamber. Inspector Hale examined the room with the methodical thoroughness I would come to recognize as characteristic of him. He studied the furniture, running his fingers over the carved roses on the headboard, examining the faded silk on the walls. He opened the wardrobe and examined the gowns, noting their quality and style. He lifted the perfume bottles on the vanity, held them to the light, and set them down again with careful precision. He read several of the letters, his expression carefully neutral, though I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes at certain passages. And when he had finished, he turned to me with a question I had not expected. "Have you searched for evidence of where she might have gone?" I shook my head. "I assumed that she died here, or that Lionel sent her away." "There is another possibility," he said quietly. "She may have left of her own accord, or been taken. The question is why her presence should manifest now, in this way, if she is indeed dead." I had no answer to offer, but something in his tone suggested that he was no longer entirely the skeptic he had claimed to be. "You came here expecting to find fraud," I said, "a hoax or a deception." "I came here expecting to find something," he agreed. "I have investigated many cases involving claims of the supernatural, and in every instance I have found a rational explanation: fraud, delusion, misunderstanding." He paused, his eyes meeting mine. "The dead do not communicate with the living, Lady Ashford. That has been my experience. But I am also a man who follows evidence, and when the evidence leads somewhere unexpected, I am willing to follow." There was something in his voice that intrigued me, a hint of weariness beneath the professional composure, as if he had seen too much and believed too little, and was searching for something to restore his faith in the unseen world. I recognized that weariness. I felt it in myself, the exhaustion of living a life that held no meaning, going through the motions of an existence that seemed increasingly pointless. "Will you stay?" I asked impulsively. "To continue your investigation?" He considered the question for a moment. "If your husband will permit it, I will speak to him." And so began the strangest and most transformative period of my life at Thornwick Hall. Inspector Hale established himself at the inn in the village, a modest establishment that catered to travelers and occasional visitors to the great house. He came to Thornwick each day, arriving after breakfast and staying until dinner, conducting his investigation with methodical persistence. He interviewed the servants, one by one, asking them about their observations and memories. He examined the estate records, searching for any mention of Cecilia Vane or evidence of payments made to mysterious recipients. He studied the portrait for hours, making sketches and notes, documenting every change in its appearance. And he spent time with me. I cannot say exactly when I began to look forward to his visits with an anticipation I did not fully understand. Perhaps it was from the very first day, when he listened to my story without skepticism or condescension, treating me as an intelligent woman capable of observing and interpreting evidence. Perhaps it was later, as our conversations deepened and I began to see the man beneath the professional exterior, the man who had questions of his own and doubts he rarely voiced. Or perhaps it was the afternoon when we stood together in the garden, watching a storm approach across the moors, and he told me about the case that had first made him question the boundaries of the natural world. "It was in Cornwall," he said, his voice distant with memory. "A fishing village where 3 men had drowned in a single night, all in calm waters, all experienced sailors. The villagers claimed it was the work of a mermaid, a creature that had been sighted by several witnesses in the weeks before the drownings." "Did you find an explanation?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "I found evidence. Footprints on the beach that might have been human or might have been something else. A song that several people reported hearing on the night of the drownings. A song that seemed to come from the water itself. And a woman's body washed up on the shore 3 days after the final death. A woman no one in the village had ever seen before and who was never identified. What did you conclude?" Officially, I concluded that the men had been victims of an unusual current, and that the other phenomena were the result of superstition and imagination. He paused, his gray eyes meeting mine. "Unofficially, I have never been certain. There are things in this world, Lady Ashford, that resist explanation. Things that suggest the boundaries we believe in so firmly are not as solid as we imagine." In that moment, I saw him not as an investigator, but as a seeker, a man who had dedicated his life to finding truth and had discovered that truth was far more elusive than he had expected. It was a quality I recognized in myself, the restless need to understand, to look beneath the surface of things, to find meaning in a world that often seemed determined to withhold it. We walked together in the afternoons, when the weather permitted, through the gardens and the parkland of Thornwick Hall. He told me about other investigations he had conducted, cases where the explanation had seemed obvious until it wasn't, where the boundaries between the living and the dead had blurred in ways he could not explain. There was the case of the séance in Mayfair, where a grieving mother received messages from her dead son that contained information no living person could have known. There was the haunted house in Greenwich, where footsteps echoed in empty rooms and objects moved of their own accord. There was the portrait in Hampstead, not unlike our own, that seemed to change its expression depending on who was looking at it. In each case, he had searched for the rational explanation, the hidden mechanism, the confederate lurking behind the curtain. In each case, he had found something. But the something had never fully satisfied him. There were always loose ends, unexplained elements, details that did not quite fit the tidy narrative of fraud or delusion. "I have never spoken of these experiences to anyone," he admitted one afternoon as we walked along the avenue of lime trees. "My superiors at the yard value rational explanations and closed cases, not metaphysical speculation. A detective who believes in ghosts is not a detective who will be promoted." "Do you believe in ghosts?" I asked. He was silent for a long moment. "I believe in evidence," he said finally. "I believe in what can be observed and documented and tested. But I also believe that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy." He glanced at me, a hint of a smile on his lips. "Shakespeare," he added. "I know," I replied. "Hamlet. I have read it." "Of course you have." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, more personal. "You are an unusual woman, Lady Ashford. You have a quality that I find rare in the circles in which I move, a willingness to see what is actually there rather than what you expect to see, a courage to question and to seek. It is a quality I admire greatly." I felt a warmth spread through me at his words, a pleasure that had nothing to do with the compliment itself and everything to do with the man who offered it. "I admire the same quality in you," I said. "Eleanor," he said impulsively. "My name is Eleanor." There was a pause, a moment of hesitation, And then he spoke again, his voice careful. "Eleanor," he repeated. And there was something in the way he said it, a warmth and an intimacy that made my heart quicken. "Eleanor, I am Marcus." It was a small thing, the exchange of given names, but in the formal world of Victorian society, it was significant. I had crossed a line, and he had crossed it with me, and we both knew that something had changed between us. Our conversations grew longer, deeper, more personal. He told me about his childhood in Yorkshire, the son of a clergyman who had expected him to follow in his footsteps. He had studied at Oxford, excelled in philosophy and logic, and then shocked his family by choosing to join the Metropolitan Police rather than take holy orders. He had wanted to make a difference, he said. He had wanted to find truth in a world full of lies. I told him about my own childhood, the merchant's daughter raised to be a lady, trained in accomplishments I did not want, and married to a man I did not choose. I told him about the loneliness of Thornwick Hall, the cold corridors and colder silences, the years of quiet desperation that had preceded the discovery of the hidden room. I told him things I had never told anyone, and he listened with an attention that made me feel valued, significant, worthy of being heard. I was falling in love with him. I knew it even as it happened, even as I tried to resist it. He was a policeman, a man of no particular social standing, and I was a countess, bound by marriage and duty and the expectations of a world that would condemn us both if our feelings became known. But the heart does not obey the rules of society, and my heart had chosen Marcus Hale. I do not know if he felt the same. He gave no outward indication, maintaining always the professional distance appropriate to our relative positions. But there were moments when our eyes met and held, when his hand brushed against mine and lingered, when the air between us seemed charged with something unspoken. I treasured those moments, hoarding them like a miser hoards gold, knowing that they were all I would ever have. The investigation continued, but its nature had changed. We were no longer seeking to disprove the supernatural. We were seeking to understand what Cecilia wanted, what message she was trying to send, what peace she needed in order to rest. It was Madame Orlova who provided the key. She arrived at Thornwick Hall uninvited, descending from a hired carriage in a cloud of velvet and perfume. She was theatrical in appearance and manner, draped in shawls of jewel tones and jangling with bracelets and necklaces that clinked as she moved. Her hair was black, improbably so for a woman of her apparent age, and her eyes were dark and penetrating beneath dramatically arched brows. She introduced herself as a medium of international renown, a Russian émigré who had fled the turbulence of her homeland to bring her gifts to the more receptive audiences of England. She had heard of the haunted portrait at Thornwick Hall, she declared, and she had come to offer her services in communicating with the spirit that had caused such disturbance. Under other circumstances, I might have dismissed her as a charlatan. Her accent was thick and somewhat inconsistent, suggesting origins more mundane than Russian nobility. Her manner was extravagant to the point of absurdity. And the spiritualist movement, as I had learned from my conversations with Marcus, was rife with fraud, with mediums who used tricks and confederates to create the illusion of contact with the dead. But there was something in her eyes, beneath the showmanship, that suggested genuine knowledge. When she looked at me, I felt seen in a way that went beyond the physical, as if she could perceive not just my face, but my soul, my fears, my secret hopes. "The spirit is not at rest," she declared upon examining the portrait. "She has unfinished business, something she needs to say, or something she needs to be done." Lionel, who had been informed of her arrival and had emerged reluctantly from the east wing, regarded her with barely concealed contempt. "This is nonsense," he said. "There are no spirits. The portrait is old, and the paint is deteriorating. Nothing more." Madame Orlova fixed him with her dark gaze. "You know better than that, my lord," she said softly. "You know what you have lost, and you know that loss has not accepted its ending." Lionel paled, but said nothing. I should like to hold a séance, Madame Orlova continued. Tonight, if possible. The spirit is restless, and she will not wait indefinitely. We must give her the opportunity to speak. Lionel looked as if he wanted to refuse. His jaw tightened, and I saw his hands clench at his sides. But Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm and reasonable. Lord Ashford, a séance would provide valuable evidence for my investigation. If the medium is a fraud, her deception will be revealed. If she is genuine, we may learn something that will help resolve this matter. Either way, refusing now would only prolong the uncertainty. It was a clever argument, appealing to Lionel's desire to put the matter behind him. After a long moment, he nodded curtly. Tonight, then. But I warn you, Madame, if this is some kind of trick, you will regret it. Madame Orlova smiled serenely. There are no tricks here, my lord. Only truth. That evening we gathered in the drawing room for the séance. The room had been prepared according to Madame Orlova's specifications, with the furniture cleared away and a round table set up in the center. Black velvet covered the table, embroidered with silver thread in patterns that suggested stars or perhaps eyes, watching us from the fabric itself. Candles had been arranged around the perimeter of the room, dozens of them, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The curtains were drawn against the night, heavy velvet that blocked every trace of moonlight, and the gaslight had been extinguished, leaving only candlelight to illuminate our proceedings. The effect was otherworldly, as if we had stepped out of the ordinary world and into some liminal space where the rules of reality no longer applied. The familiar drawing room, with its comfortable furnishings and cheerful wallpaper, had become a chamber of mystery, a portal between the living and the dead. I had dressed carefully for the evening, choosing a gown of deep purple that seemed appropriate for the occasion. Madame Orlova had instructed us to wear dark colors, explaining that bright hues could disturb the spirits, and I had followed her guidance without question. Even Lionel, who had expressed contempt for the entire enterprise, had donned black evening clothes, though whether from superstition or simply the desire to have the matter finished, I could not say. The servants had been dismissed for the evening, sent to their quarters with instructions not to disturb us under any circumstances. The house was silent around us, so silent that I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway and the faint creak of settling timbers. It was the kind of silence that seemed to have weight, pressing against the ears, making every small sound seem magnified and significant. Madame Orlova sat at the head of the table, her eyes closed, her hands flat on the velvet surface. Her breathing was slow and regular, and her face had taken on a quality of profound stillness, as if she had retreated into some inner chamber of her soul where the rest of us could not follow. The candlelight played across her features, accentuating the lines around her mouth and the darkness of her eyes, making her look ancient and powerful, a priestess of some forgotten religion. Lionel sat across from her, pale and tense, his jaw set in an expression of barely suppressed anxiety. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white with the force of his grip, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. Whatever contempt he had expressed for spiritualism, some part of him believed that what we were about to attempt was real, and that belief terrified him more than he would ever admit. Marcus sat beside me, his presence solid and reassuring, and I was grateful for the warmth of his nearness in the chill of the darkened room. His hand found mine beneath the table, out of sight of the others, and his fingers intertwined with mine in a silent gesture of support. I drew strength from his touch, from the knowledge that whatever happened in the next hour, I would not face it alone. We sat in silence for several minutes, waiting for Madame Orlova to begin. The candles flickered and danced, throwing wild shadows on the walls, and the air seemed to grow colder, though no draught stirred the heavy curtains. I could feel my heartbeat quickening, could hear the blood rushing in my ears, and I wondered if the others felt the same anticipation, the same mixture of fear and hope that gripped me now. Finally, Madame Orlova spoke. "We gather here tonight to speak with one who has passed beyond the veil," she said, her voice low and measured. "We come with respect and with humility, seeking not to command, but to listen. We ask the spirit of this house to make herself known, to share with us her burden, to tell us what we may do to bring her peace. She paused, and the silence seemed to deepen around us. Spirit of this house, she continued, her voice taking on a deeper, more resonant quality than her speaking voice possessed. We call upon you. Cecilia Vane, we invite you to speak. Tell us what you need. Tell us what will bring you peace. For a long moment, nothing happened. The candles flickered in a draught I could not feel, and the shadows danced on the walls. But there was no response, no sign that anything out of the ordinary was occurring. I began to think that this was indeed a fraud, that Madame Orlova was simply a clever actress who had heard the rumors and come to Thornwick hoping for payment or publicity. And then the candles died, all of them at once, plunging the room into complete darkness. I heard Lionel's sharp intake of breath, felt Marcus's hand close over mine in a grip that was both protective and steadying. The darkness was absolute, the kind of darkness that presses against the eyes and makes you question whether you have lost your sight entirely. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow, and the pounding of my heart in my ears. And then, in the darkness, a voice spoke. It was not Madame Orlova's voice, not the theatrical accent she affected, but something softer, younger, filled with a sorrow that made my heart ache. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls and the ceiling and the air itself. He promised me, the voice said. He promised that the world would know, that I would not be forgotten. What did he promise? Madame Orlova asked, her own voice barely above a whisper. My music. He promised to share my music, the songs I wrote for him, the compositions that were my heart on paper. He promised that even if my name was hidden, my voice would be heard. I heard a sound from Lionel's direction, a strangled gasp that might have been a sob. I wrote for him, the voice continued. I wrote because I could not speak, could not walk in the world as his equal, could not stand beside him in the light. My music was all I had, all I could give. And he promised me that it would not die with me. The candles flared back to life, all of them at once, filling the room with sudden, blinding light. Madame Orlova slumped in her chair, exhausted, her face drained of color. The voice was gone, the presence dissipated, but the message remained, hanging in the air like the last notes of a song. Lionel's face was ashen. I looked at him and understood. She composed music, I said. Original compositions. And you promised to publish them, to share them with the world. He nodded, his voice rough. She was brilliant. Her voice was beautiful, yes, but her true gift was composition. She wrote songs that would have made her famous had she been permitted to claim them. Operas, symphonies, pieces for piano and voice that surpassed anything being written by the celebrated composers of our time. I promised her that I would see them published, that her music would live even if her name could not be acknowledged. But after she died, I could not bear to look at them. I could not bear to be reminded of what I had lost. I locked them away and tried to forget. Where are they now? In my study, in a locked drawer. I have not touched them in 2 years. Marcus rose. Then we must touch them now. Together. The 4 of us went to Lionel's study in the east wing. The room was large and cluttered, filled with books and papers and the detritus of estate management. Lionel moved to his desk with the slow steps of a man approaching his own execution. He unlocked a drawer with a key from his pocket and withdrew a leather portfolio thick with papers. Inside were pages and pages of musical notation, handwritten in the same flowing script I had seen in Cecilia's letters, each piece titled and dated, each one a window into a soul that had been denied expression. There were songs for voice and piano, their lyrics written in Italian and French and English. There were symphonic movements, sketched out with notations for orchestration. There was what appeared to be an entire opera. Its pages yellowed with age but still legible, the work of years condensed into a sheaf of paper. I am not a musician, but I recognized beauty when I saw it. These compositions were works of art, created by a woman who had been hidden away from the world, whose gifts had been enjoyed by one man alone when they should have been shared with thousands. "This is what she wants," Marcus said quietly. "She wants her music to be heard. She wants the promise kept." Lionel stared at the pages in his hands, and something in his face shifted. The grief was still there, the guilt and the regret, but beneath it I saw something new. Resolution. Purpose. A reason to move forward. "I will see them published," he said. "I will hire the finest musicians in London to perform them. I will ensure that her compositions are heard, even if her name must remain a mystery. This I can do for her. This I should have done long ago. It was not a complete redemption, but it was a beginning." And in the days that followed, as Lionel threw himself into the project of bringing Cecilia's music to the world, I watched the portrait in the gallery and saw no further changes. The face that looked out from the canvas was neither Lady Catherine's nor Cecilia's now, but something in between, as if the two women had found a way to coexist, as if the spirit was waiting, watching, not yet satisfied, but willing to hope. Madame Orlova remained at Thornwick for several days, offering guidance on how to proceed with the spiritual resolution of the case. She was less theatrical in private than she had been in her initial appearance, revealing herself to be a shrewd and intelligent woman who had cultivated her extravagant persona as a form of protection. "The world does not take seriously a woman who speaks of spirits," she told me one afternoon as we walked in the garden. "But they will listen to a spectacle. They will pay attention to a show. And sometimes, in the midst of the show, real truth can slip through." "Is that what happened at the séance?" I asked. "Real truth?" She smiled enigmatically. "What do you think?" "I think that Cecilia Vane spoke through you. I think she told us what she needed, what would finally bring her peace." "Then perhaps that is what happened," Madame Orlova agreed. "Or perhaps I'm simply a clever actress who knew how to give voice to a story I had already intuited from the evidence around me." She shrugged. "Does it matter which explanation is true if the result is the same?" I supposed it did not. The first concert of Cecilia's compositions was held in London in June, in a small but prestigious hall that attracted the attention of critics and society alike. The Wigmore Hall, with its intimate acoustics and distinguished history, was the perfect venue for the debut of an unknown composer's work. The seats were filled with critics from the major newspapers, society matrons seeking the latest sensation, musicians curious about this mysterious new voice, and ordinary music lovers drawn by the whispers of something extraordinary. The pieces were presented as the work of an anonymous composer, a woman of talent who had died young and whose identity would never be known. The program notes, written by Lionel himself under a pseudonym, spoke of music found in an attic, compositions rescued from obscurity, a voice from the past crying out to be heard. It was the sort of romantic narrative that Victorian audiences loved, and they came prepared to be moved. They were not disappointed. The concert began with a song cycle for soprano and piano, settings of English poetry that ranged from tender love lyrics to passionate declarations of longing. The soprano, a young woman named Clara Whitmore, who had been carefully selected for the purity of her tone, brought tears to the eyes of hardened critics. Her voice soared through the hall, carrying Cecilia's melodies into hearts that had never known her name. I attended that concert, seated in a box beside Marcus, who had extended his investigation at Thornwick beyond all reasonable necessity and had finally admitted, at least to himself, that his reasons for remaining had nothing to do with police work. We sat side by side in the velvet-draped box, our shoulders almost touching, and listened as Cecilia's music filled the air around us. I cannot adequately describe what I felt in that moment. It was as if the woman whose room I had discovered, whose letters I had read, whose fate had haunted my dreams for months, had stepped out of the shadows and taken her place on the stage. Her music spoke of love and longing, of sacrifice and sorrow, of the desperate need to be remembered. And I, who knew her story as no one else in that audience could know it, felt her presence beside me, as vivid and real as the music itself. Beside me, Marcus reached for my hand and held it, and I let him, propriety be damned. There are moments that transcend the rules of society, moments that demand authenticity regardless of the consequences. This was one of them. Lionel sat alone in another box, across the hall from where Marcus and I were seated. His face was wet with tears, and he made no attempt to hide them, no attempt to maintain the stoic composure expected of an English earl. He was listening not just to the music, but to the voice of the woman he had loved. Finally freed from silence, finally permitted to speak to the world as she had always deserved to speak. The concert continued with an orchestral piece, a symphony in miniature that showcased Cecilia's gift for melody and her sophisticated understanding of harmony. The musicians played with passion, drawn into the music by its emotional power, and the audience sat in rapt attention, barely breathing, as if afraid that any sound might break the spell. And then, as the final piece, the organizers had chosen the most ambitious of Cecilia's works, the first act of an opera she had never completed, based on the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. It was a work of staggering beauty, telling the story of a man who descended into the underworld to rescue his beloved, only to lose her at the final moment because he could not resist the temptation to look back. The parallels to Lionel and Cecilia's own story were unmistakable, at least to those of us who knew the truth. The audience, unaware of the autobiographical elements, simply heard a work of genius, a marriage of music and drama that surpassed anything they had experienced before. The soprano who sang Eurydice's farewell aria brought the audience to tears, her voice carrying the words that Cecilia had written in her hidden room, words of love and loss and the acceptance of an impossible fate. When the final notes faded and silence filled the hall, there was a moment of absolute stillness. No one moved, no one breathed, and then, as if released from a spell, the audience erupted in applause. They stood from their seats, cheering and clapping, calling for the performers to take bow after bow. The critics scribbled furiously in their notebooks, already composing the rave reviews that would appear in the morning papers. The society matrons dabbed at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs and declared that they had never heard anything so moving in all their lives. And I, in my box above the chaos, felt something I had not expected to feel. I felt joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy for a woman I had never met, whose voice had finally been heard, whose music had finally touched the hearts it was meant to touch. Cecilia Vane, who had lived in shadows and died in obscurity, was being celebrated at last. Her name might never be known, but her soul, distilled into melody and harmony, would live forever. Something shifted in the world that night. I felt it in the air, a lightness, a release, as if a weight had been lifted from Thornwick Hall itself. The music soared through the concert hall, beautiful and heartbreaking and triumphant, and I thought of Cecilia in her hidden room, writing by candlelight, pouring her soul into compositions that she believed would never be heard. She had been heard now, her voice had been released, and though her name would never be known to the world, her music would live on, touched by thousands of hearts, remembered when all of us were dust. When we returned to Thornwick the following day, the portrait had changed for the final time. Lady Catherine had returned to the canvas, her features restored to what they had been before the haunting began. But there was something different about her expression now, a softness that had not been there before, as if she too had found peace. And in the corner of the painting, almost hidden in the shadows of the library, I thought I could see the faint outline of another figure, a woman with dark hair and dark eyes who seemed to be smiling. Madame Orlova, who had accompanied us back to Thornwick to witness the resolution of the case, declared the spirit at rest. "The promise has been kept," she said solemnly. "The dead have been heard, and they are content." She collected her fee, which was generous, and departed with theatrical flourishes and predictions of future fame for the anonymous composer. Lionel thanked her gravely and then retreated to his study, where I found him later that evening, sitting in the darkness with Cecilia's letters in his hands. "I loved her," he said when I entered. "I loved her, and I failed her. I kept her hidden in life and silent in death. I do not deserve forgiveness." "Perhaps not," I said gently, "but you have begun to make amends. Her music is in the world now. Her voice has been heard. That is something." He looked at me, and for the first time since our marriage, I saw him truly see me, not as a transaction, not as a duty, but as a person. A woman who had shown him kindness when she had every reason to feel betrayed. "I have been unfair to you, Eleanor," he said. "I married you without offering you anything but a title and a cold house. I have been a poor husband. You have been a grieving man," I replied. "There is a difference." We sat together in the darkness, not touching, not speaking, but something had changed between us. The wall that had separated us was crumbling, not into love, perhaps, but into something like understanding, something like respect. We would never be lovers, he and I, but we could be friends. We could be partners in the strange arrangement that was our marriage, and that, I realized, was more than many couples ever achieved. In the weeks that followed, Lionel and I found a new way of existing together. We spoke honestly with each other, shared meals and conversations, walked together through the gardens of Thornwick Hall. He told me stories of Cecilia, of their love and their dreams and their tragedy, and I listened without jealousy. She had been part of his heart, and acknowledging that did not diminish my own place in his life. And then there was Marcus. He had remained at Thornwick longer than his investigation required, finding reasons to return again and again, even after the case was officially closed. The Yard had been satisfied with his report, which attributed the changing portrait to an unusual chemical reaction in the paint and made no mention of seances or spirits. The case was closed, the file was archived, and Inspector Hale was free to move on to other assignments. But he did not move on. He came to Thornwick day after day, and we walked together in the afternoons, our conversations ranging from philosophy to literature to the nature of the unseen world. We spoke of everything and nothing, and in those conversations I found a connection I had never known before, a meeting of minds and hearts that transcended the barriers of class and propriety. It was on a walk in late June, as the summer sun turned the gardens golden and the air was heavy with the scent of roses, that he finally spoke the words I had been longing and dreading to hear. "Eleanor," he said, stopping on the path and turning to face me, "I must return to London. The Yard has been patient, but I cannot delay indefinitely. There are other cases, other duties. I cannot justify remaining here any longer." "I know," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "You have been more than generous with your time." He reached out and took my hand, and the touch sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the breeze. His fingers were warm and strong, and they held mine with a gentle firmness that made me feel anchored, safe. "I find myself in an impossible position," he said quietly. "You are married, you are a countess, and I am a policeman of no particular distinction. Society would condemn us both if I spoke what is in my heart." He paused, his gray eyes searching my face. "But I find that I cannot leave without you knowing." "Then perhaps you should not speak it," I whispered, even as my heart begged him to continue. "Perhaps I should not," he agreed. "But I find that I cannot remain silent. Eleanor, in these weeks, I have come to care for you more deeply than I ever expected to care for anyone. You are brave and kind and curious and true. You deserve more than a marriage of convenience to a man who cannot love you. You deserve to be cherished." I met his eyes, and I saw in them everything he was not saying. I saw love, real love, not the passionate fire of Lionel and Cecilia, but something steadier, something that could be trusted. I saw a future that I had never dared to imagine, A life of partnership and companionship with a man who saw me, truly saw me, and valued what he saw. Marcus, I whispered, and his name on my lips felt like a prayer. Tell me to leave, he said. Tell me that this is madness, that there can be nothing between us, and I will go. I will return to London and close this case and never trouble you again. I should have told him exactly that. I was a married woman, bound by law and custom and duty. What he was offering was impossible, a dream that could never be realized without scandal and ruin. Society would destroy us both if our feelings became known. My position, my reputation, my very identity as Countess of Thornwick would be forfeit. But I was tired of doing what I should. I was tired of being the obedient daughter, the dutiful wife, the woman who sacrificed her own heart for the sake of propriety. I had spent my entire life conforming to expectations, following rules I had never chosen, living a life designed by others. And where had it brought me? To a cold house and a distant husband and an existence devoid of meaning or joy. I cannot tell you to leave, I said. I cannot, because I feel the same. His hand tightened on mine, and I saw hope kindle in his eyes. Bright and fierce and beautiful. Then what do we do? I do not know, I admitted. I only know that I am not willing to pretend anymore. Not to myself, not to you. Whatever comes of this, Marcus, I want to face it with honesty. He raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my fingers, a gesture that was both tender and bold, a declaration that needed no words. Then we will face it together. The months that followed were complicated in ways I could not have predicted. Lionel, when I finally told him the truth, reacted not with anger, but with something like relief. He had long suspected that something was growing between the inspector and me, and far from being jealous, he was glad. You deserve happiness, Eleanor, he said. You have shown me nothing but kindness, even when I gave you nothing in return. If Marcus Hale can offer you what I cannot, then I will not stand in your way. But there is no way, I protested. We are married. The law binds us. The law can be navigated, he replied. There are arrangements that can be made discreetly, without scandal. You would remain my wife in name, and I would remain your husband, but we would live separate lives. It is not uncommon among the aristocracy, this sort of arrangement. It requires discretion, certainly, but it is not impossible. He paused, his expression thoughtful. I failed Cecilia because I was too afraid to defy convention, too bound by what society expected of me. I will not make the same mistake with you. You have been a better wife than I deserved, Eleanor, and you have helped me find a measure of peace with my past. The least I can do is help you find happiness in your future. It was not a conventional solution. It was not what society would approve. But it was honest, and it was kind, and it allowed all of us to move forward with our dignity intact. And so, a new arrangement was forged. I remained the Countess of Thornwick, presiding over the household and fulfilling my social duties, but my heart and my time belonged to Marcus Hale. He left Scotland Yard and established himself as a private investigator, taking on cases that interested him and declining those that did not. He rented rooms in the village near Thornwick Hall, close enough for frequent visits, far enough for discretion. Our love grew slowly, without the fevered intensity of forbidden passion, but with a warmth and steadiness that felt like coming home. We walked together and talked together and sat in companionable silence, and in those quiet moments I found a happiness I had never known was possible. It was not the dramatic love of novels and operas, but something better, something real. It was the love of two people who saw each other clearly and chose each other anyway. Lionel, meanwhile, devoted himself to Cecilia's legacy. Her compositions were performed throughout England and then throughout Europe, attracting acclaim and admiration from critics and audiences alike. The mystery of the anonymous composer became a subject of fascination. with theories and speculation filling the pages of musical journals. Some claimed she was a noblewoman who had been forbidden to publish under her own name. Others insisted she was a nun, or a governess, or a member of the royal family. The truth, of course, was stranger and sadder than any of their imaginings, and though her name remained hidden, her voice was heard at last. The music of Cecilia Vane filled concert halls and drawing rooms, touched hearts and brought tears to eyes, and in that music she lived on, immortal in a way that flesh and blood could never be. On the anniversary of that first concert, I stood in the north gallery of Thornwick Hall and looked at the family portrait. Lady Catherine gazed serenely from the canvas, her features undisturbed. But I still thought I could see that faint figure in the shadows, the woman with dark hair and a gentle smile. "You are at peace now," I whispered. "Your music lives. Your story is told, even if only we who live in this house know the truth. Rest well, Cecilia." There was no response, of course. The dead do not speak, not in words that can be heard. But I felt something in that moment, a warmth that wrapped around me like an embrace, and I knew that wherever Cecilia's spirit had gone, she was content. I turned from the portrait and walked out of the gallery, out of the house, into the garden where Marcus was waiting. He stood beneath the old oak tree, his coat thrown over one arm, his face turned up to the summer sky. When he saw me, he smiled, and my heart lifted the way it always did in his presence. "Is everything well?" he asked as I reached him. "Everything is well," I replied. "Everything is finally, truly well." He offered me his arm, and together we walked through the gardens of Thornwick Hall, past the roses and the hedges and the ancient stones, into a future that neither of us had expected, but both of us had come to cherish. My name is Eleanor Ashford, and this is the story of how I found a ghost, uncovered a secret, and discovered that love can bloom in the most unexpected places. It is a story of loss and redemption, of promises kept and hearts healed. And though the woman whose face appeared on the portrait is gone, her music plays on, and her memory lives in the walls of this old house, a reminder that even the dead have voices, if only we are brave enough to listen. The years have been kind since then. Thornwick Hall has lost its chill, warmed by laughter and music and the footsteps of those who move through its corridors with purpose rather than duty. Lionel has found a measure of peace, his guilt eased by the knowledge that he finally honored his promise. And Marcus and I have built a life together, unconventional by the standards of society, but honest and full of love. There are still nights when I wake and feel a presence in the room, a whisper of perfume, a brush of silk. I do not know if it is Cecilia or merely memory, but I am not afraid. She brought me to Marcus in her way. She shook me from my complacency and forced me to seek truth. If her spirit lingers, it lingers with blessing, not with malice. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the candles burn low and the music plays softly from the piano in the drawing room, I think I can hear her singing. It is the sound of a woman finally free. This is the end of my story, but not the end of hers. Cecilia Vane's compositions continue to be performed in concert halls across the world, beloved by audiences who will never know the name of their creator. Critics marvel at the emotional depth of the music, the way it seems to speak of longing and loss and the fierce determination to be remembered. They debate the identity of the anonymous composer, constructing theories and dismissing them, never guessing that the truth lies hidden behind a tapestry in a manor house in the English countryside. Let them wonder. Let them debate. The mystery is part of her legacy now, as much as the music itself. And those of us who know the truth guard it carefully, not out of shame, but out of respect for a woman who loved too deeply and lived too briefly and refused to be forgotten. I close my journal now and set down my pen. Outside the window, the sun is setting over the gardens of Thornwick Hall, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Marcus will be here soon, and we will dine together, and later we will walk in the moonlight and talk of everything and nothing the way we always do. I am the Countess of Thornwick, wife in name to a man who has become my friend. I am the beloved of a detective who saw past my title to the woman beneath, and I am the keeper of a secret that binds me to a ghost, a promise unspoken but understood. Cecilia Vane's face no longer appears on the portrait, but her presence remains in this house, woven into its stones, echoing in its hallways. And I am grateful for her, grateful for the mystery that brought Marcus to my door, grateful for the disruption that shook me from my quiet despair. Some ghosts haunt us to destroy, but some ghosts haunt us to save. I know now which kind she was. The candle on my desk flickers, and for a moment, I think I see a shadow move in the corner of the room. But when I look, there is nothing there, only the gathering darkness and the scent of roses drifting through the open window. I smile and blow out the flame. "Good night, Cecilia," I whisper, "and thank you." The darkness settles around me, soft and peaceful, and I am not afraid. I have loved and been loved. I have faced ghosts and found truth. And tomorrow, when the sun rises over Thornwick Hall, I will begin another day in this strange and wonderful life I never expected to have. This is my story. This is her story. This is the story of how the dead can change the living, and how even the deepest secrets cannot remain hidden forever. And somewhere, in a concert hall in Paris or Vienna or New York, a violinist lifts her bow and begins to play. The notes rise into the air, pure and sweet and achingly beautiful, and the audience falls silent, transported by music that speaks of love and loss and the fierce, unquenchable desire to be remembered. It is Cecilia's voice they hear. It is Cecilia's heart that moves them. And though they will never know her name, they know her soul. That is the truest kind of immortality. Not the preservation of the body, not the carving of names in stone, but the continuation of what we create, the ripples we send out into the world that go on long after we are gone. Cecilia Vane created beauty in a hidden room, and that beauty lives on. And I, Eleanor Ashford, have the privilege of knowing her story, of guarding her secret, of ensuring that her voice is never silenced again. It is a responsibility I bear with pride. And as the years pass and the world changes, as new centuries dawn and old ways fade, I like to think that somewhere, in some form, Cecilia knows. She knows that her music fills the air, that her melodies bring tears to eyes and joy to hearts, that the promise made to her in a hidden room behind a tapestry has been kept at last. She knows that she is not forgotten. And that, I think, is all she ever wanted. The portrait hangs in the gallery still, unchanged now, showing Lady Catherine in her dignified repose. But sometimes, when the light is just right and the house is very quiet, I swear I can see another face beneath the surface, dark eyes and a gentle smile, watching over all of us. I like to think she is happy. I like to think she has found the peace that eluded her in life. And I like to think that, somewhere, beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead, she and Lionel have been reunited at last, free to love each other in a world without barriers or prohibitions. It is a comforting thought. It is the thought that lets me sleep at night, knowing that the story of Thornwick Hall, for all its tragedy, has ended in something like grace. My name is Eleanor Ashford. I came to this house as a transaction, a business arrangement dressed in wedding white. But I leave this narrative as something more. I am a woman who found her voice, her strength, her capacity for love. I am a woman who faced the supernatural and emerged not just unscathed, but transformed. And I am forever grateful to the ghost who made it all possible. The music plays on. The story continues. And love, in all its forms, endures. This is my truth, written in my own hand, to be read by those who come after me and wonder about the woman in the portrait, the detective in the village, the countess who kept secrets and told tales. Read it and remember. Read it and believe. The dead have voices. The past has power. And some promises are strong enough to transcend the grave. I know this because I have lived it. And I would not change a single moment, not a single word, not a single note of the music that brought us all together and set us all free. The end draws near, but endings are never truly final, are they? They are simply pauses, moments when one chapter closes and another begins. And though my story has reached its conclusion, the story of Thornwick Hall continues. There will be other mysteries to solve, other secrets to uncover, other hearts to heal. I will be ready for them. After all, I have learned something valuable in these months of discovery. I have learned that the past is never truly past. It lingers in the walls of old houses, in the faces of portraits, in the music that plays on long after the composer has gone. And those who are willing to look, to listen, to seek, will always find more than they expected. I found a mistress hidden in a secret room. I found a husband's grief and a detective's love. I found a ghost who wanted not revenge but recognition, not to harm, but to be heard. And I found myself. That, perhaps, is the greatest discovery of all. The fire burns low in the grate. The stars emerge one by one in the velvet sky. And I, Eleanor Ashford, set down my pen for the final time, content in the knowledge that my story, like Cecilia's music, will endure. Read it and remember. This is what it means to be human, to love, to lose, to hope, to heal, to keep promises even when keeping them is hard, to listen for voices that speak from beyond the grave, to believe in the power of truth and the persistence of the heart. This is what I have learned at Thornwick Hall. And this is what I offer to you, dear reader, whoever you may be, whenever you may find these words. May you find your own truth. May you hear your own music. May you discover, as I have discovered, that love is always worth the risk, and that some ghosts are sent not to haunt us, but to save us. Until we meet again, in this world or the next. With all my heart, Eleanor Ashford, Countess of Thornwick, keeper of secrets, believer in ghosts, lover of truth, the end.